A mug of coffee sits in the microwave for the third time before noon. You answer a text while scanning your inbox, mentally rehearsing a conversation you still need to have later tonight. Remember the form you forgot to sign. Notice the laundry sitting in the dryer. And suddenly you realize you walked into the kitchen without remembering why you came in there in the first place. And what's interesting about that is most people immediately interpret moments like this as a personal failing. They assume they're distracted, undisciplined, bad at managing life. But when you really step back and look at modern life, especially for women in midlife, a lot of what people call laziness is actually cognitive overload. The nervous system can only process so many open loops before it begins operating in a kind of constant background strain. And for many women, that strain has been building for years, not because they're incapable, but because they've become the emotional operations center for almost everyone around them. They remember birthdays, schedules, appointments, conversations, groceries, deadlines, medications, passwords, emotional dynamics, family logic, school emails, work expectations, text messages that still need responses. Even during moments that technically look like rest, the brain often never fully powers down. And after enough years of living that way, many people begin assuming exhaustion is simply their personality. They start saying things like, I'm just scattered. I'm bad at following through. I can never stay consistent. My brain never stops. But the brain was never designed to constantly hold this many active inputs at once. And I think a lot of people underestimate how much invisible mental labor they're carrying because it rarely looks dynamic from the outside. Sometimes it simply looks like low grade tension that never completely leaves the body. You're sitting on the couch, but part of your attention is still rehearsing tomorrow. You're eating dinner, but mentally organizing the next 3 tasks. You're watching a show at night while simultaneously scrolling your phone because the nervous system has become so accustomed to stimulation that silence almost feels uncomfortable now. And over time, what starts happening is the brain loses opportunities for restoration. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because the nervous system rarely experiences true completion anymore. There's actually research around something called attentional residue, which is the mental drag that happens when attention keeps rapidly switching between unfinished tasks. Part of your brain remains attached to the previous thing even after you've technically moved on to the next one. So if your day constantly looks like email, text, laundry, work task, social media, conversations, reminder, notification, back to work, phone call, check calendar, your nervous system never fully settles into sustained focus or recovery. And the difficult part is that modern life quietly rewards this kind of fragmentation. Being constantly reachable gets normalized. Multitasking gets praised. Mental overextension gets mistaken for responsibility, especially for women who have spent decades learning to become highly adaptive to everyone else's needs. The nervous system interprets that as ongoing environmental demand, which means even when there isn't an emergency happening, the body can remain in a low-grade state of activation. And eventually, people start wondering why they feel exhausted by lives that technically don't seem that bad. But cognitive fatigue doesn't always come from major trauma or dramatic crisis. Sometimes it comes from the accumulation of thousands of unresolved micro decisions. What should I make for dinner? Did I answer that email? Should I switch careers? Do I need to text her back? What time is that appointment? Why can't I get myself organized? Did I pay that bill? Should I be doing more? Am I forgetting something? The brain treats unresolved decision as active loops. And when too many loops remain open simultaneously, mental bandwidth narrows. That's partly why overstimulation often creates emotional instability, not because someone is weak, but because the nervous system has lost margin. And honestly, I think many women have been functioning inside chronic decision saturation for so long that they no longer recognize what internal steadiness even feels like anymore. Everything starts feeling reactive. You wake up already mentally behind. Your attention gets pulled outward all day long. And by evening, even simple decisions feel strangely exhausting. What's interesting is that this also changes the emotional tone of life over time. When the brain becomes overloaded, creativity often shrinks. Curiosity shrinks, reflection shrinks. You stop hearing your own thoughts clearly because there's too much competing input happening internally all at once. And eventually, life can start feeling strangely flat, not because you've stopped caring, but because the nervous system has shifted into management mode instead of presence. I think this is one reason so many people say things like, I don't even know what I want anymore. Because chronic overstimulation makes self awareness harder. The signal gets buried underneath constant noise. And for women in midlife specifically, this becomes even more complicated because this stage of life often contains overlapping emotional roles simultaneously. You may be supporting aging parents while still helping adult children, managing work expectations while privately reevaluating your identity, trying to improve your health while also feeling emotionally depleted, trying to simplify life while living inside systems that constantly demand more attention. And when that goes on long enough, many people unconsciously begin adapting to survival pacing, meaning reacting becomes more familiar than intentional choosing. That's important to understand because many people are trying to solve nervous system exhaustion with motivation. But motivation doesn't solve cognitive overload. More pressure usually increases it. And this is where simple systems become emotionally important, not because systems make you more productive, but because they reduce unnecessary internal negotiation. That's a very different conversation. The goal is not becoming optimized. The goal is creating conditions where your nervous system no longer has to work so hard all the time. And when you really look at the healthiest forms of structure, they often function less like rigid discipline and more like environmental support. For example, think about how much mental energy gets consumed through repeated tiny decisions every morning. What should I wear? What should I eat? What do I need to remember today? Where did I put that thing? When am I going to exercise? Should I do it now or later? Now, imagine reducing even a portion of that friction through simple defaults. Clothes prepared the night before, a consistent breakfast, a visible calendar instead of mentally tracking everything, keys always placed in the same location, a short evening reset that helps tomorrow feel less chaotic. Those things sound small, but the nervous system experiences predictability as safety. And over time, repeated predictability reduces internal strain. That's part of why routines often feel emotionally stabilizing during stressful seasons. Not because routines are magical, but because the brain conserves energy when behaviors become automated. Decision fatigue research shows that the more choices people make throughout the day, the harder future decisions become, which means by evening, many people aren't lacking willpower. They're neurologically depleted. And honestly, once you understand that, a lot of self judgment begins softening. You stop moralizing your exhaustion. You stop assuming your inconsistency means something is wrong with you. Instead, you begin asking a different question. What systems would make my nervous system feel more supported? That question changes everything because now the goal is perfection. It's reduction of unnecessary friction. For some people, that may mean simplifying digital inputs, Maybe not starting the morning with social media. Maybe turning off non essential notifications. Maybe creating periods during the day where the nervous system is not constantly interrupted. And what's interesting about digital overstimulation is the brain never fully recalibrates when attention is continuously fragmented. Dopamine driven scrolling trains the nervous system to expect constant novelty, which makes stillness feel unfamiliar. That's why phone free walks can feel surprisingly emotional for some people at first. The nervous system begins slowing down enough to actually process internal experience again. I've noticed this in my own life sometimes. There are days when my attention feels stretched across so many directions that even sitting quietly feels uncomfortable for the first 10 minutes. And then I think many people assume that discomfort means they're bad at slowing down. But often it simply means the nervous system has been overstimulated for too long. Another practical shift that can help significantly is creating transition rituals, especially after work. A lot of people move directly from one dynamic cycle into another without any nervous system reset in between. Work mode flows naturally into dinner. Dinner flows naturally into responsibilities. Responsibilities flow directly into screens. And suddenly, the entire day has passed without any emotional decompression. Even a 10-minute transition can matter. Changing clothes, going outside briefly, stretching, sitting quietly without input, listening to music while cooking instead of consuming more information. Small rituals signal to the nervous system we are moving out of one state into another. That pacing matters more than many people realize. I also think home environments affect emotional regulation much more deeply than people sometimes acknowledge, not from an aesthetic perfection standpoint, but from a nervous system standpoint. Visual clutter creates additional cognitive input. Too many unfinished piles, too many visible reminders, too many things competing for attention. The brain continues scanning all of it in the background, which is why simple environmental resets can feel disproportionately calming. Clearing the kitchen counter, resetting the sink before bed, preparing tomorrow's coffee, opening the blinds in the morning. These aren't productivity hacks, they're forms of environmental steadiness. And over time, repeated steadiness changes how the body moves through life. I think many people are searching for massive breakthroughs when what their nervous system actually needs is more consistency, more pacing, and fewer unnecessary decisions. Because eventually there comes a point where constant overstimulation begins disconnecting people from themselves. You stop noticing your own preferences, your own exhaustion, your own emotional signal. Everything becomes reaction management. And the difficult part is that people can function that way for years while appearing completely capable on the outside. But internally, something starts narrowing. Joy narrows, presence narrows, attention narrows. The nervous system becomes so accustomed to management mode that calm can start feeling unfamiliar instead of natural. And that's not the kind of life most people actually want. I don't think midlife is only asking people to reinvent themselves. I think sometimes it's asking people to stop living inside constant cognitive compression, to become more intentional about what deserves access to their attention, to recognize that mental bandwidth is finite, to understand that simplification is not laziness, it's discernment. And maybe one of the most important forms of maturity is learning that not everything deserves equal access to your energy anymore. Not every notification deserves your attention, and not every request deserves immediate access. Not every thought deserves extended mental residency. Sometimes clarity returns gradually when life becomes less internally crowded, when the nervous system finally experiences enough steadiness to hear itself think again. And maybe that's part of what so many people are actually longing for right now. Not a completely different life, but a life that feels more breathable, more intentional, and supported supportive of the human nervous system they actually have. Because at some point, constantly living in reaction mode starts costing something deeply personal. If you miss your own life while managing it, and I think many women reach a season where they realize they don't want to spend the next decade emotionally overstimulated and mentally scattered all the time. They want steadiness, presence, room to think clearly again, not because life becomes perfect, but because they begin participating in it differently, more intentionally, selectively, and honestly. So maybe this week, instead of asking, how do I become more productive? A better question might be, what would help my nervous system feel more supported on an ordinary Tuesday? That question tends to lead people somewhere much more sustainable. If this episode resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to Clarity Reset. And if you want additional tools to help simplify mental overload and reconnect with clarity, I'll leave the Clarity Reset resources below for you as well. Until next time, take care of your mind gently. It's been carrying more than most people can see.